Welcome to Property Insight. My name is Neil Harding.
My name is Mark Ashworth.
Today we're going to be talking about the new Renters' Rights Bill, and in particular, what does it mean for increases in rent? How can you do it? How much? How often? We're going to explore that with our expert on the sofa today, Steve Mitchell, who's with us to talk about it. Section 13 notices. So currently you can increase rent once a year with a Section 13 notice using, I think, a Form 4, and that's the formal process. And you can only increase rent up to market rent currently, no more. In the new bill, it's saying you can only increase rent once a year. Kind of sounds the same. What's different?
It's a little bit different in the sense that currently today we have fixed term contracts. So there is a provision where you can review the rent at the end of that fixed term before it goes into periodic. So if you have a 6-month fixed term contract, there is an opportunity to review the rents at that point in time. So that will go, because there'll be a removal of fixed term contracts. So that's going to go. What will be left in the new world is, as you rightly say, the removal of clauses to prescribe rent reviews at specific periods. You'll only be able to review rents once a year or every 12 months, depending on when that contract will start. So to my mind, there isn't a huge amount of difference, because in our letting agency with our clients, we only do rent reviews once a year, if that. And it's down to the decision of the landlord or the property owner as to whether they want to do a rent review, because there is a flip side to reviewing rents, which is the potential loss of a tenant. And if you've got a really good tenant, why would you want to potentially jeopardize that? So there'll still be decisions to be made whether you're a property owner, or advice to give if you're a letting agent. But I think, to my mind, this is a reasonable thing to put in the bill, but I don't think it's a game changer, personally.
I agree. One of the things that I did notice in the detail of the draft bill is that the notice period to be given on a Section 13 notice is going to be increased from 1 month to 2 months. So if you're the sort of landlord that has a portfolio of tenants and properties, and if you're anything like me, I review all of those every month, and I always consider what the current rent is, when the rent anniversary is, because I don't increase rents more than once a year anyway, and I always look out in future 1 month to think about, is a rent increase appropriate or not? So I'm just going to have to change my admin and my planning to make that a 2-month lookout instead of a 1-month lookout. But ultimately, most of the landlords that I know are only thinking about rent increases once a year, not more than that. I suppose it might be different if you're buying something that is particularly way below market rent, and you're then trying to come to an agreement with the tenant as to how you can bring that rent up to something more reasonable.
Yeah.
And maybe more frequent than once a year is appropriate for all parties. But apart from that, I don't think I know any landlords that are doing more than annual increases anyway. Do you, Mark?
No, and I think it's quite interesting talking about rent increases, because certainly since we've had massive inflation across the world, I've certainly looked at rents on a much more regular basis with HMO rooms as well as single lets. So when I first started investing in HMOs, which was about 8 years ago, once a tenant was in that room, they never paid any more rent, even if they were there for 2, 3, 4 years, because interest rates were very low, costs weren't going up, inflation was very steady at probably 2% or less each and every year, which is what we expect it to be and what the government's target is. And so therefore the only rent increase that I would make is if that person moved out of that room and I was to find a new tenant. And actually, in some respects, a lot of single let landlords were also doing the same thing. They'd review the rent as and when that tenant moved. Or if they were going to increase the rent, it might only be maybe 2, 3, 4% at the most. Whereas now we're talking, with inflation the way it's been, I've certainly increased some of my rents between 8 and 10% because they were grossly under market value in the first place. Yeah. So those rent increases have been far more prevalent in the last, I'd say, 3 to 4 years than they ever have been since we've seen that interest rate go. If you look at the curve on a graph, interest rate's gone like this. And obviously that's had a knock-on effect on people's costs and also general inflation anyway. So, everything's gone up, and so therefore everything follows suit. So I think hopefully over the next few years, if things settle down on that front and we do maintain inflation at a decent level and the interest rate starts to drop a little, I don't think it's going to go much lower than it is now, but it certainly might drop a bit, and the economy stabilises and we all get into a normal rates of inflation, I think that those rent increases will be less important and less of a factor.
Yeah, but my personal view is I think it will have more of an impact on tenants because, as you've rightly said, and we've done this in our own portfolio. We up in Liverpool, we didn't implement rent increases on an annual basis. We had a couple of tenants that hadn't had a rent increase for 5 years. Now, that's our decision, but what this bill will do, it will put a lot more focus on it. And so you can bet your bottom dollar that rent reviews and rent increases will definitely happen every single year. The question is, how much is it going to go up by, and what's the mechanism that's going to be put in place in order to determine what that maximum increase will be? Now it's down for every individual property owner to decide whether they go to the full maximum or not. But is it going to be wage growth? Is it going to be CPI? Is it going to be inflation? Until we get some guidance, or is it going to be a combination of all that? It's a bit like they do with the pensions and the triple lock. Is it going to be the lowest of whatever measures, one of those three measures they talk about? So there's still a lot in the air, but I do think that this will have a continually upward pressure on rents, and whilst it's not incumbent upon the landlord or the property owner or the letting agent to recommend rent reviews, it certainly brought it more into the landlord's eyes, certainly, and I can talk from experience, that we will be reviewing rents every single year.
I think it's a really interesting point. Throughout the series of videos that we've been doing on reviewing the Writers' Rents Bill, there's been this theme, a thread running through all the videos of us asking the question, is this going to actually put upward pressure on rents? And it feels like this is again something that may well do, because as you were saying, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of landlords that actually are perfectly happy not to increase rents if they don't particularly need to. Happy tenant, happy landlord, they treat the place well. I'm not interested in another £20 a month or whatever. So, and they won't have put the rent up for a number of years. And okay, they might have discovered that they're below market rent and it's very difficult to catch up. But nevertheless, I know landlords that do that. If you know now that you only have that one opportunity a year, suddenly you'll be thinking about it in a way you wouldn't have been before. And you'll be thinking, I don't think I can afford to miss this opportunity. If it's I either do this now or I have to wait a whole other year to do it. Maybe the legislation will be phrased in that way. You've got to do it on the 12-month anniversary, and if you don't, you've got to wait for the 24-month anniversary. Yeah, I'm not sure.
But I think it's you're absolutely right, and I totally agree with you. But I think there's another level to it because we live in a world that is more volatile. So you talked about interest rates. I remember going back to, we're in 2024, so going back to 2022, knowing that the 5-year fixed term on some of our properties were due to expire, and looking at the rents that I'm charging and looking at what the interest rate is likely to go to, ergo my mortgage is going to go up. So I'm now planning 2 years out. I haven't put the rents up for the last 3 years. I now need to think about putting the rents up because interest rate volatility is a lot higher. So I actually agreed to rent increases for the next 2 years with most of our tenants. And we wrote them a nice letter. We explained that we hadn't put rents up previously because, let's face it, when you are owning a buy-to-let, your only two real costs are your mortgage and a bit of insurance. And if your mortgage is fixed for 5 years, you could argue that you're profiteering. I mean, it's an investment, it's a return, so it's not profiteering. But from a renter's perspective, you could say putting the rent up, if your costs haven't gone up, is profiteering, not realising that's how we sort of use our income to live, and all of our living costs have gone up. But from a renter's perspective, it could be seen as profiteering. So we hadn't put our rents up, and we wrote them a nice letter saying, this is what the new world is, this is what it's likely to be. We're proposing a rent of this for the next 12 months and a rent of that for the following 12 months. Are you in agreement? And they all come back and said yes. And they even said thank you for letting us know, because we can now adjust our budgets and work out how we're going to be able to fund the rent increases and stay in the property, because they're all great tenants, and they have families, they put down roots, they go to schools and all that. And we felt it was fair to give that sort of fair and prior warning. So the mortgage now gets renewed, and because we can only review our rents once a year now, it's going to put, as you say, it's going to put more focus on, well, what's going to happen to interest rates in the next period of time? And do I need to be building up a pot or a reserve as a property owner or as an investor to fund any potential interest rate cost increases that I'm going to face? Because if I don't build up that reserve, then it's going to impact my margins. Now, if you're a renter, you might say, well, again, greedy landlord and all that type of stuff. But it's economics. It's a fact that interest rates are probably not going to stay at 2% as they were in previous years. The interest rate environment is likely to be around 3 to 5% for the foreseeable future. And we need to be building reserves in order to adjust to that new interest world. And at the end of the day, if you decide not to put your rent up in that 12-month period and costs go up, insurance costs go up, because again, that's an annual basis. If you're in HMO land, then utility costs are all over the place at the moment. They're on a slightly downward trajectory now, but who knows what will happen in the new year. And by not taking the opportunity of the rent increases in that one period of time that you've got, then you're leaving yourself open as a property owner to reduce margins. And if it's reduced margins, then what's the point of investing? At least that's my theory.
Really interesting. Thanks, Steve. So hope you found that insightful. Please do watch us on the next video. There's lots more to come. Please do comment, like and subscribe to the channel. Look forward to seeing you next time.